The haven at Comphaven dried out twice in every day, and it had done so for as long as there had been a town on that shore to watch it happen. At the top of the tide, the water came up green and quiet along 300 yards of dressed stone, and the coasters lay against the long quay with their yards squared and their sides against the fenders, and a stranger looking down from the hill at Bratton Cross would have sworn there was a proper harbour under him, deep and safe and English. 6 hours after that there was no harbour there at all. There was a floor of grey sand and black mud, with a thread of fresh water wandering down the middle of it, and the coasters were sitting on their bilges with their bottoms showing and their masts all leaning the one way. And the sea had gone out 1/4 of a mile beyond the bar, and was working at the sand out there and making a sound like a cart going over gravel a long way off. From the bottom of the board steps, which stood at the middle of the long quay and were the only public way down into the haven, it was 340 yards over hard ground to the edge of the water at the bottom of a spring ebb. Every child in that town knew the distance, because every child in that town had walked it, picking over the ridges for whatever the sea had left. On the morning of the 4th of February, in the year 1802, Damaris Yeo went down the board steps at the bottom of the morning's ebb and walked out over that ground with a coil of small line over her shoulder and her right hand shut round the shaft of a long ash-handled hook. She was 30 years of age. She was broad through the shoulders, in the way of women who have pulled an oar since they were 7, brown at the neck and wrists all the year round, and pale everywhere the weather never got at her, with black hair pinned up hard under a knitted cap, and grey eyes set deep under level brows, and she had a mouth that people took for temper, and that was mostly only attention. Her hands were split across the knuckles from November to April, and she had stopped noticing it about the time she stopped being young. She wore a woman's petticoat of brown stuff, a man's short jacket tarred at the shoulders, and boots that had been soaked and dried so many times that the leather had gone the colour and nearly the hardness of horn. She had never in her life owned a gown that anybody would have called a gown. What Damaris Yeo could do, and what the whole of Comphaven knew she could do, was read the water over the Sull. The Sull was the bar that lay across the mouth of the River Merrick, a great curved ridge of sand 3/4 of a mile long that moved a little every winter, and a great deal after a hard blow from the west, and the only way through it was a crooked channel that the town called the Gut. The Gut was never twice in the same place in the same year. It shifted with the freshes coming down out of the moor, and it shifted with the ground swell coming in off the Atlantic, and a master who had brought his vessel in over the Sull in September and came back for her in March would put her ashore on the middle ground with a full fair wind, and never understand what had happened to him. Reading it was not a matter of a chart, because no chart could keep up with it. It was a matter of standing on the point at Cagehead in all weathers for 20 years, and watching how the broken water moved, where it stood up and where it lay down, where the ripple went smooth and greasy over deep, and where it went into small chopping tails over shoal, and knowing what a west-northwest swell did to the north tail, and what the first of the flood did to the whole of it. Damaris had begun watching it at 7 years old, sitting on the point with her father, and had never stopped, and by the time she was 20, there was not a man in the haven who could stand beside her and see what she saw. For this the board of the haven of Cumbaven paid her nothing whatever, and had never paid her a farthing in her life, because by the 4th article of its own by-laws the board was empowered to license as pilots of the haven only such persons as were men of the haven, being of full age, and sworn. That was the whole of it. It was 7 words long, and it had been written in 1751 by men who had not troubled themselves to imagine her, and it had never once been argued about, because there was nothing in it to argue about. A woman could not be sworn, therefore a woman could not be licensed, therefore no pilotage in the haven had ever been performed by a woman, and the books of the board proved it, and the books of the board were correct, and every ticket and every entry and every receipt for 7 shillings and 6pence or for 15 shillings was signed and countersigned in the proper way, and named a man. The man they named was her brother. Jarvis Yeo was 20 years old, sandy and long in the arms, and he had been sworn 3 years before, at 17, and held the license for the northern grounds. He was not stupid, and he was not a coward in the ordinary run of things. He had gone into the water off the point after a dog and after a boy, and after another man's oar, without stopping to think about any of them. But he had stood on the quay at 14 years old, with a lantern in both hands, on a night that will be come to, and he had seen a thing done on the sand that he had not been able to do himself, and after that night he could not go out over the Sull in dirty weather without his hands starting to go. He could take a vessel in on a fine day with a leading wind. He could not read the gut. He had never been able to read it, and he never would. So the arrangement was this, and it was so old by 1802 that nobody in the town found it remarkable. When a vessel was sighted standing in for the Merrick, the pilot gig went off from the board steps with 4 at the oars, and Jarvis Yeo, licensed pilot, sat in the stern, and Damaris Yeo, who had no standing of any kind, sat on the after thwart in front of him with her back to the vessel and her eyes on the water. She told him where the gut was. She told him in a low voice, in half a dozen words at a time, and he said the words out loud to the master, and the master put his helm over, and the vessel came in. The ticket said Jarvis Yeo. The receipt said Jarvis Yeo. The 7 shillings and 6pence for a vessel under 100 tons and the 15 shillings for a vessel over it were counted into the hand of Jarvis Yeo, and Jarvis Yeo carried the money down the quay and put it on the table in the cellar under his mother's window, and every single person on that quay knew exactly what had happened, and not one of them wrote it down. There were 62 men in the haven who got their bread off the water, licensed and unlicensed, hobblers and pilots and ferrymen and the crews of the 4 ketches, and all 62 of them knew. They knew it the way people know the weather. It was not a secret, and it had never been a secret. It was simply a thing that was not said, in the way that a great many arrangements in a small English town are not said. And the reason none of the 62 said it out loud was standing at the top of the board steps most mornings in a good drab coat, with his hands behind his back. Mr. Absalom Roach was 54 years old that winter, and he owned the Long Quay. He owned it by purchase, outright, wall and stone in the ground behind it, and he had bought it 12 years before out of the money he had made in the coal and culm trade, which he had gone into as a hobbler's son of 18, with nothing but a share in a boat. He owned 7 vessels. He owned the lime kilns at the head of the Pill, the rope walk behind the church, the 2 lighters and the ground the rope walk stood on, and the beer license of 4 of the 6 houses in the town. He was master of the board of the haven, which meant that no man moored, landed, loaded, took ground, dried a net, or was sworn as a pilot in Cumbaven, except by his say-so. And in the spring of the year before, he had been put into the commission of the peace for the 100 of Bratton, so that he was now one of the 2 magistrates before whom any man in that town who gave trouble would be brought. He was not a shouter. That was the thing about him that people took longest to understand. He was a heavy, well-made, upright man with a wide red face and a great deal of white hair brushed back, and he was pleasant to everybody, and he did not raise his voice from one year's end to the next, and he settled the whole of his business in short, reasonable sentences, delivered with the manner of a man who is sorry about the necessity. On the 2nd of January that year, a hobbler named Velicott had crossed him about the ground rent for a net rack, and Roach had stood in the doorway of the boardroom with his hat in his left hand, and said, quite kindly, that he was afraid the rack would have to come off the wall by Saturday, and that as the man's mooring in the Pill was on sufferance, and always had been, he had better bring the boat up on the hard, and that he hoped his wife was better. He then went to his breakfast. The rack came off the wall on the Friday. Nobody in that town needed the thing explained to them twice. His son Nathan was 28, and was as big as his father, and about half as certain of himself, and had the Providence, the board's own boat, a heavy 6-oared gig that lay at moorings off the board's steps and was kept for the board's business. Nathan Roach was not a bad man. That is worth saying at the start, because a great deal of what happened in that town in March of 1802 happened because Nathan Roach was not a bad man and had been living for 6 years as though he were, and it had got into him the way damp gets into a wall. The thing that had brought the whole town down onto the Long Quay on the 4th of February was a boat, and behind the boat was a gentleman, and behind the gentleman was a knight, in December 6 years before, that Cumbaven had never entirely stopped talking about. The boat was finished, and lying under a sail in Pinnock's yard, at the head of the Pill. She was 30 feet on the keel, double-ended, built of larch on oak, with 2 full rows of cork along her sheer strakes, and 8 air cases under her thwarts, 10 oars double-banked, and she had been building since the summer at a cost that Pinnock would not name to anybody, but that his apprentices put at $700, and did not believe themselves. She was not a fishing boat, and she was not a pilot boat. She was meant to go out and take men off wrecks, and she was the first thing of the kind that had ever been seen west of the Parrot. And because Cumbaven dried, and because a boat lying in a harbour that has no water in it is an ornament and nothing else, the gift did not stop at the boat. There was a carriage building for her too, with wheels 6 feet high and a shaft for 4 horses, so that she could be run out of a house on the quay, up Bratton Lane, along the top road and down the slipway at Sander Cove, and put into the sea from the beach on any state of the tide there was. There was ground bought for the boathouse. There was a deed drawn for the whole of it, boat and carriage and house and ground, to be held for the town for ever. And there was an annuity, The annuity was the part the town talked about. By the deed of gift, $40 a year for life and after them to their widows was to be paid to each of 7 named men of Comphaven, in consideration of their having gone off in the board's boat Providence on the night of the 3rd of December, 1796, and taken out of the water on the Sull, a passenger of the brig Amity of Ilfracombe, 8 souls aboard her, and 1 only saved. $280 a year in that town, in that year, was not a sum. It was a change in the order of things. It was more than the 4 catches together paid their masters. The 7 names had been settled 6 years before and had never been looked at since. They were Absalom Roach, Nathan Roach, Jory Pethick, Wilmot Slee, Reuben Chugg, Amos Prowse, and Hal Tredenick, and they had between them been paid $600 in reward money in the January after the wreck by a man of business who came down from the east in a chaise, on the strength of an affidavit sworn before a lawyer at Barnstaple. The affidavit had gone away east in the chaise with the man of business. Nobody in Comphaven had ever read a line of it. Nobody in Comphaven had ever asked to. The gentleman was Gervase Cassel, 6th Duke of Walsingham, and he was 34 years old, and on the night of the 3rd of December, 1796, he had been Lord Gervase Cassel, a duke's 2nd son of 28, with $100 in the world, and a father who had stopped speaking to him, working his passage home along the coast in a collier brig, because it was the cheapest way of getting there. His elder brother had died 4 years ago of a thrown horse. He had come into a title he had never expected, and an estate of 23,000 acres, and the first money of his own he had ever handled, and the first thing he had done with it, before he did anything else at all, was to send for a shipwright. He came into Comphaven on the last of the flood at 3 in the afternoon of the 4th of February, in a hired cutter out of Bristol, and the whole of the town was out to see it, and Absalom Roach had drawn up the 62 men of the haven along the long quay in 2 ranks in their best jerseys, with the board's flag on the pole at the steps, and had put the gentry of the neighbourhood behind him under the wall in furs and greatcoats, Sir Hugo Marwood and his 2 daughters and the Trennant's people, and a dozen more, because Roach did nothing by halves, and had understood from the first letter exactly what this day was going to be worth to him. What none of them saw, and what mattered more than any of it, was what happened on the water half an hour before. The cutter had stood in too far to the north, and had the last of the flood under her, and the master was a Bristol man who had been over the Sull twice in his life, and if he had held the course he was on for another 2 minutes, he would have put her on the north tail in front of the entire population of the town. The pilot gig went off from the steps with 4 at the oars, and came alongside in the broken water, and Jarvis Yeo went up over the cutter's rail, and stood by the master, and Damaris Yeo came up after him, and stood at the rail 2 paces behind her brother, with her hood back, and her hands on the wet iron, looking at the water. The Duke of Walsingham was standing on the weather side, with his left hand round a shroud, and he was near enough to hear her. "Nothing to starboard," she said. "It is dead water there, and it is lying. Bring her head to the 2 black rocks on the shore, and hold it there while I count you, and do not mind the sea on your bow. That is the tail, and it is going by. Now round with her." Her brother said it out loud to the master, and the master put his helm up, and the cutter went through the gut with the broken water snarling and sliding away down both sides of her, and came into flat green water inside the bar so suddenly that 2 of the servants aft sat down. The Duke did not look at the shore. He looked at the woman at the rail, and something went through him that he could not put a name to and did not like, because it had no business happening on a Thursday afternoon on a hired cutter, and because he had felt it once before, going out of the world with his mouth full of sand, and had spent 6 years being told he had imagined it. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the tail of the bar going by, the way a man looks at a road he has to come back along. Then the cutter came alongside the long quay, and there were 62 men in 2 ranks and a flag, and Absalom Roach at the head of the steps with his hat off, and the thing began. It went well for an hour and a quarter. Roach spoke and the Duke spoke, and the boat was uncovered in the yard, and everybody went up to look at her and came back, and the deed of gift was talked of, and the day was named for the execution of it, which was to be the last day of March, because Pinnock could not get the boat off the ways, except on the top of a spring tide, and the last big spring of the season fell on that day, and there was a great deal of good feeling and rum, and the sun came out flat and hard off the water at the top of the tide, so that the whole quay was white with it, and the masts of the coasters stood up along the wall like a wood. And then Absalom Roach brought his son forward, and put him in front of the Duke of Halsingham, and said, in his pleasant, unhurried way, that here was the man who had had his grace by the coat. Nathan Roach put out his hand. He had to. His father's hand was between his shoulder blades. He was a big man, and he went the color of brick, and he could not get his eyes above the 3rd button of the Duke's coat. And the Duke took his hand in both of his own, and held it, and said something quiet to him that nobody else heard. And the 62 men on that quay stood and watched it, and said nothing at all, and somewhere back in the 2nd rank, a man made a noise in his throat, and turned it into a cough. Loveday Yeo, who was 51, and had kept a beer cellar under the quay for 26 years, and had never been afraid of anything in her life, said out loud, from the wall, "Well, God forgive the lot of you." It was not a shout. It was worse than a shout. It fell into that quay the way a dropped bucket falls into a church. Damaris was standing at the foot of the board steps with her jacket still wet to the elbow. She had not meant to speak. She had held her tongue on that subject for 6 years, for reasons that were good and that will be given, and she had come to think of it as a stone she had swallowed and could live with. But her mother had said it in front of everybody, and her brother had gone white beside her, and Nathan Roach had turned his head and looked straight at her with an expression on his face that she had not seen on it since he was a boy of 22 coming down the steps at first light, and before she had decided anything she heard her own voice saying, quite levelly, that no boat had gone off that night. Absalom Roach laughed. It was the only laugh on the quay, and it was a good-humoured one, and he said she was a good soul and had been out in the cold since 6, and would somebody take her down and give her something hot. The Duke of Halsingham did not laugh. He came down 2 steps and stopped, and he looked at her for a moment too long, and then he did the thing that he would think about for the rest of his life. He had the affidavit with him. He had carried it in his breast for 6 years, the way another man carries a letter, folded in 4, brown along the creases. Because it was the only account of the worst and best night of his life that he possessed. and because he had read it so many times that he had stopped being able to see it. He took it out and unfolded it, and he put it into her hands, and he said, 7 men signed this before a lawyer 7 weeks after it. That was never a woman's hand. He said it without heat and without unkindness, in the flat voice of a man declining to be imposed upon, which is a worse voice than anger. And he said it in front of the 62 men of the Haven, and Sir Hugo Marwood and his daughters, and the whole of the gentry of the neighborhood under the wall, and the town. Damaris Yeo looked down at the paper in her 2 hands. She had a moment, perhaps the length of a breath, in which she could have begun to read it aloud. Absalom Roach took it out of her fingers. He came across the front of the Duke and took hold of the top corner of the sheet and pulled it up and away in one movement, with his arm going out to its full length and his head going back, laughing all the while, and saying that they would not have his Grace's own paper going into the harbour, and the sheet tore along the 3rd fold and left a strip of it in her closed hand. And there was laughter then, a good deal of it, from the gentry under the wall, and from 3 or 4 of the men in the 2nd rank, who had drink in them and did not know what they were laughing at. Somebody's daughter gasped. A boy dropped a rum can, and it went over the edge and hit the deck of a ketch below. That was the 4th of February at the top of the tide, with the harbour full to the wall and every boat in Comphaven afloat. The bill for it came in the next morning, and it did not come to her. On the 5th of February, the board of the Haven of Comphaven, sitting as it was entitled to sit, with Mr. Absalom Roach in the chair and 2 of the 4 other members present, suspended the license of Jarvis Yeo, pilot, for irregularity in the conduct of the pilotage of the cutter Swift on the previous day, in that the said pilot had permitted an unlicensed person to be carried in the gig and to come aboard a vessel under pilotage, contrary to the 5th article. The suspension was for 3 months in the first instance. It was minuted in 4 lines. Roach was sorry about it, and said so, and told Jarvis Yeo, who stood in the middle of the boardroom with his cap in both hands, that the article was the article, and that he had no more liking for it than the boy had, and that he hoped his mother's chest was easier this winter. 3 months took them to the 5th of May. The pilotage of the northern grounds was the whole of that family's money. What they had besides it was a cellar that sold beer to men who were themselves out of work in February, a father who could no longer close either hand, and 23 shillings in a jug. It was put about in the town, by nobody in particular and therefore by everybody, that the reason for the suspension was that Damaris Yeo had made a fool of herself on the quay in front of a duke, and that she had been after the annuity, and that there was no harm in her, but she should have known better than to lay hold of a thing like that at her age, and that some folk get above themselves when a great man comes into a small place. It was said kindly, most of it. That was the worst of it. A woman can stand being hated better than she can stand being excused. Damaris said nothing at all for 3 days. Then she went out at the bottom of the tide, as she went out most days, and walked the ground. This is what had happened on the night of the 3rd of December, 1796, and it had taken about 20 minutes from beginning to end. The brig Amity of Ilfracombe, laden with coal out of the Welsh side, had come down the coast late in a rising southwesterly gale, and had tried for the Merrick on the last of the ebb, which no master with any sense does, and had missed the gut by 150 yards, and struck the middle ground of the Sull at about 1:30 in the morning. It was low water that night, at 2:00, and it was the biggest spring tide of that winter. The alarm gun on the point was fired at 1:45 by a customs man, and by 2 the whole town was on the long quay with lanterns and tar barrels, and there was nothing whatever that any of them could do, and every one of them knew it before he got there. There was no water in Cumbaven. The harbour was a floor. The Providence lay off the board steps on her moorings with her keel 4 feet down in the sand, as she did at the bottom of every ebb of her life. And the 4 ketches sat on their bilges along the wall, and beyond them there was 340 yards of ridged hard sand and broken shell, and beyond that the wet sand, and beyond that the Sull with the sea breaking clean over the top of it and going up white in the dark. A vessel could be seen out there when the surf came up behind her, lying over with her masts gone, close enough that a man with a good voice might have been heard from her if the wind had been the other way. 8 souls. The town stood on the quay and watched them come off her one at a time, and every one of them went down on the seaward side and stayed there. The last of them did not. The last of them came over the top of the bar on a sea, the way 1 in 50 does, and was carried across the shoal water on the inside and put down in 18 inches of ebb on the hard sand, with the back run trying to take him out again, 340 yards from where the whole town was standing. Damaris Yeo was 24 years old. She went down the board steps with a coil of 2-inch line over her shoulder, and she took her boots off, and she ran. That is the entire mechanism of it, and there is nothing else in it. And the reason nobody else did it is not that Cumbaven was full of cowards. It was that in the dark, in a gale, at the bottom of a spring, with the sand running with 2 inches of fresh water on the top of it, and the wind coming off the sea at 50 miles an hour, the ground between the quay and the water is a thing that punishes you the moment you get it wrong. And the only person on the long quay who had walked it 4,000 times and knew every ridge and every runnel and every soft place on it in the pitch dark was a woman of 24, and she did not stop to explain herself to anybody. Her brother Jarvis, who was 14, went as far as the bottom of the steps with the lantern and could not make himself go further, and stood there and held it up, and that lantern is the reason she found her way back. She got a bite of the line round the man under both arms, and she got his face out of the water and turned him over, and she put her mouth against his ear and said the same thing to him over and over, because it was the only thing that was any use. Blow it out. Do not take it in. Blow it out, and I will do the rest. Then she hauled him 340 yards up that ground on his face, because she could not carry him, and there was no other way to move 12 stone of drowned man, and she went at it with the line over her shoulder in the way a horse goes at a load, and the ridged sand and the broken shell took the skin off the insides of both his forearms from the wrist to the elbow while he did it. And he was awake for the first part of that, and knew nothing about the last of it. She brought him up the board steps at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning into the light of 40 lanterns, and put him down on the stone, and the first man to reach her and take the weight off her was Nathan Roach. who was 22, and who got down on his knees on the wet stone beside her, and looked at her, and never in 6 years said one word about it to any living creature. 2 days later, in the boardroom, with the gentleman insensible at the ship and a man of business expected out of the east, Absalom Roach had explained to Damaris Yeo, pleasantly, that she had been on the board's business that night, whether she knew it or not. That the board's business was the board's. That there would be no unlicensed person's name in any account going out of that room, and that her brother was 14 and would be wanting a ticket of his own in 3 or 4 years, and that he himself would be very glad to see him get it. And she had been 24, and had a mother and a father and a boy to feed, and she had looked at the floor and said nothing. That was the price, and she had paid it, and she had gone on paying it for 6 years without complaining about it, and until the 4th of February 1802, she had genuinely believed that she had made a fair bargain. At the other end of England, the man she had hauled up the sand had spent those 6 years failing to understand his own body. He had lain at the ship at Combaven for 5 weeks. He had been out of his senses for the first 8 days, and when he came back into them, the surgeon from Bratton had already taken sand out of his throat, and out of both ears, and out from under his eyelids, and had remarked to the landlord that he had never in his life had so much sand out of a man who had been taken up out of deep water. Both of Gervase Cassell's forearms were flayed on the inner side from wrist to elbow, and had to be dressed twice a day for a month, and they healed into 2 long ropes of white scar that he had carried ever since, and that he could not account for, and that he had asked 4 medical men about at different times in different counties, and had been told by all 4 that the sea does strange things, and that he should be glad it was not his face. What he remembered was mud in his mouth, and being dragged, and a woman's voice against his ear telling him to blow out and not to take it in, and the extraordinary fact that whoever it was had not been in a boat. What he was told, when he was well enough to be told anything, was that the board's boat Providence had slipped her moorings and gone out and taken him off the bar, and that 7 brave men had done it, and that his father's man of business had settled with them. His father's man of business had the affidavit and the receipt for $600, and had transacted the whole of it at Barnstaple, where the 7 were sworn on the 22nd of January, a fortnight after the young man had been carried away east in a litter with both his arms in linen, so that Lord Gervase Cassell never in the whole of that business set eyes on one of the 7, and first read their names in a letter at 200 miles distance. Nobody asked Lord Gervase Cassell what he remembered, because nobody supposed for a moment that what a half-drowned man remembers is evidence, and he did not press it, because when a sworn paper signed by 7 men and a memory in your own head disagree, a reasonable man of 28 concludes that the trouble is in his head. He had concluded that. He had concluded it for 6 years, and every time the dream came back, which was perhaps a dozen times a year, always the same and always with sand in it, he had put it away as the thing his mind had made out of terror, and had gone back to being grateful to 7 men in Devon whose faces he had never seen. He was, in short, a man who had been given a piece of paper and had done the ordinary and honourable thing with it, which is to believe it, and to arrange the whole of the rest of his life around it, and to spend the first money he ever had in his life on making sure it never happened to anybody else. He stayed in Comphaven. That was not what anybody had expected. Roach had taken a house for him at Bratton, and had assumed he would go back east and come again for the last day of March. And instead, the Duke of Hulsingham sent the hired cutter away, and put his aunt Lady Selina Cassel, who was 61 and had come with him, because she went everywhere with him, into the best rooms at the ship, and settled himself in Comphaven for 7 weeks, with the manner of a man attending to something. He was not attending to the affidavit. He had had the torn sheet mended with a wafer by his own hand that night, and had put it away, and he was ashamed of the way he had used it, and had said so to his aunt, and his aunt had told him briskly that a person who lays claim to a public reward 6 years late in front of a duke is either mad or wanting money, and that he had been perfectly correct, and that the woman was to be given $5 and no more said. He had not given her $5. He could not have said why not. What he attended to was the boat, and the ground for the boathouse, and the deed, and the town, and the water. He was on the quay every morning. He went up to Pinnock's yard and stood about in the shavings, and asked the sort of questions that shipwrights will answer for an hour. He walked out to Cagehead in the rain. He learned, in the way a stranger learns, that the haven dried, and he thought about it in the ordinary way as an inconvenience and a reason for the carriage and the 4 horses, and he did not think about it in any other way at all, because a man does not apply what he learns on a Tuesday afternoon to a paper he has believed since he was 8 and 20. On the 16th of February, a laden ketch called the Bethel came in from the westward at the end of a hard squall, on a lee shore, with her mainsail split and the tide 2 hours flooded, and there was not a licensed pilot in Comphaven that afternoon fit to take her over the Sull. Jarvis Yeo was suspended. Pethick was at Barnstaple. The board's 3rd man was 70 and had been in his bed since Christmas. The Duke of Hulsingham was standing at the head of the board steps with Absalom Roach beside him when the gig went off, and he watched the whole of it through a glass. And what he saw through the glass was a woman in a tarred jacket go up over the Bethel's rail with a boy's agility, walk aft, put her left hand flat on the ketch's rail, and her right hand on the tiller alongside the master's, and stand there without moving for 7 minutes while the vessel came up through broken water on a course that no sane man would have taken, and lay her in over the north tail with 1.5 feet under her keel and not a bump. He put the glass down and said, without turning round, that he supposed that was a very fine pilot. Absalom Roach said that it was Nathan. The Duke did not answer for a moment. Then he said that he was glad of it, and went down to the quay, and the ticket for the Bethel, 106 tons, was made out that evening for 15 shillings in the name of Nathan Roach, and Nathan Roach signed it in the boardroom with his father watching him do it, and went out afterwards and was sick behind the lime kilns like a boy. The Duke of Hulsingham had been in the world for 34 years, and had commanded nothing and organized nothing, and had, by his own account, wasted the whole of the first half of his life. But he had one quality that was going to be worth more to Damaris Yeo than any amount of cleverness, which was that when a thing did not fit, he could not leave it alone. He had seen a woman's hands on a tiller through a glass at 400 yards. He had been told a man's name. He did not accuse anybody of anything. He simply began quietly, without a plan, and without much idea of what he was doing, to walk about that town asking people about the water. And on the 24th of February, at the bottom of a good ebb, he came down the board steps and found her out on the ground. She was 300 yards out with a hook and a sack, going along a runnel, and she did not stop working when he came up, and she did not curtsy, and she said good morning to him as she would have said it to the customs man. He asked her whether he might walk with her. She said the ground was the town's and he could walk where he liked on it. And then, because that was ruder than she had meant, she said that if he came, he was to keep to her left and step where she stepped, because there was a soft place along there that would have his leg to the knee. They walked for an hour and 10 minutes. He asked her about the gut, and she told him, and she was a different creature talking about it, quick and exact, and almost impatient, drawing the north tail for him in the wet sand, with the end of the hook held in her right hand, and rubbing it out with her boot and drawing it again the way it had been in November, and he stood with his hands behind his back, and looked down at the sand, and understood perhaps a third of it, and did not once pretend to understand more. Then he asked her, straight out, whether she had meant what she said on the quay. She stood up and looked at him for a while. Behind them the long quay was a wall of stone a long way off with small people on the top of it, and the 4 ketches were sitting on the sand under it, with their masts leaning, and out to seaward the tide was working on the Sull. She said that she had had 6 years to get used to it, and that she was used to it, and that a thing that cannot be proved is the same as a thing that did not happen, and that she had no paper and no witness who would speak, and nothing in the world but her own mouth, and that she had watched him look at her on the 4th of February, and had seen him decide, and that she did not blame him for it, and would have decided the same. She said she wanted nothing of him. She said it twice, and the second time she said it with her chin up and some heat, because he had begun to say something about the annuity. She told him she had not come down the steps that day for $280 a year, and she would not touch it if it were laid on that sand in front of her, and that what she had come down the steps for was that Nathan Roach had had to put his hand out and take hold of his Grace's hand, and she had not been able to stand and watch it. The Duke of Halsingham said, "Then tell me what you would have of me." And Damaris Yeo said, "Nothing. I would have you know it. That is all there is, and there is no way to it, so we will leave it." She picked up the sack and went on along the runnel, and he walked back 300 yards over the sand to the board steps by himself, and every step of the way he was aware, in a manner he could not push aside, that the ground under his boots was ridged hard and full of broken shell, and that his forearms had begun to ache in the cold as they did every February. Absalom Roach was a patient man, but he was not a stupid one, and he had watched a duke walk an hour and 10 minutes on the sand with a woman in a tarred jacket, and on the 2nd of March he stopped being patient. He did it by the book, which was the only way he ever did anything. An information was laid before the magistrates for the 100 of Bratton that Damaris Yeo, spinster of Combaven, had on 4 separate occasions since the 5th of February acted as a pilot within the limits of the haven, not being licensed so to act, contrary to the bylaws confirmed by the board, the penalty being $5 for every offense. The 4 occasions were the Bethel and 3 others. Every one of them was true. Every one of them had been done at the request of a master who would otherwise have gone ashore, and 2 of them had been done at the request of Roach's own agent, And none of that was any answer to anything, because the bylaw did not care why. She was brought up on the 9th of March at the Bratton Petty Sessions, in a room over the market house, with about 40 people in it. There were 2 magistrates on the bench, and one of them was Mr. Absalom Roach, who observed that he had an interest and would take no part, and then sat there for the whole of it, with his hands folded, and did not need to take any part, because the man beside him was a clergyman of 68, who had never in his life disagreed with Absalom Roach about anything, and did not begin that morning. The case took 20 minutes. She said nothing in her defense, except that the vessels had come in, which was not a defense. She was convicted on all 4 informations and fined $20 with costs, and in default of payment committed to the House of Correction at Barnstaple for 1 calendar month. She had not got $20. She had not got 2. They gave her until the Saturday. On the Friday evening, a boy came down to the cellar under the quay with $20 and 7 shillings in a canvas bag, and no message with it beyond that it was paid, and would not say who from, and ran off up the steps before Loveday Yeo could get round the barrel. She did not know that night. She found out on the Sunday, when the whole town found out, because the boy had told his mother. It was Nathan Roach. He had sold his share in the Ketch Bethel and paid his father's prosecution out of it, and by Monday morning everybody in Cumbaven knew that Absalom Roach's own son had paid the fine of the woman his father had put in the dock, and nobody could make it mean anything except the one thing it meant. And the town went very quiet, the way a place goes quiet when it has been carrying something for 6 years and somebody has finally shifted his end of it. Roach heard it on the Monday and moved at once to put it out. He was on the quay by 9, and he told 4 separate people that the boy was soft and always had been and had been got at, and he had Nathan out of the town on the Tuesday, up to the Welsh side after coal, and he wrote that evening to the Duke of Halsingham at the Ship a very good letter regretting that malicious tongues had been at work in the town against a family that had served the haven for 30 years, and requesting his Grace's permission to lay before him, on the appointed day and before the whole town, the sworn evidence upon which his Grace's own bounty had rested for 6 years, so that there might be an end of it. That was the mistake. It was the only one he made in the whole of his life, and it was enough. The Duke of Halsingham read that letter twice, and went for a walk, and came back and wrote 3 lines, saying that he would be glad to have the matter cleared up publicly on the day, and then he sat for some time with the mended affidavit in front of him on the table at the Ship, and did not open it, because he had not opened it since the 4th of February, and had begun, in a way he could not have explained to Lady Selina, to be frightened of it. His aunt was the last person in that story to come round, and she came round in her own manner. On the 20th of March she went down herself, in a chair, to the cellar under the long quay, to see the woman that everybody in that town was now talking about, on the stated ground that she wished to be sure the creature was not an impostor. And she stayed there for 2 hours, and came away and said nothing for a day, and the next morning at breakfast she informed her nephew that the mother was a vulgar woman with a great deal of sense, and that the father could not close either hand, and had wept when she asked him about his daughter, and that the daughter herself had refused to discuss the wreck at all, and had spent the whole visit talking about the boat, in particular about the way the carriage would have to be turned at the top of Bratton Lane. which Lady Selina had not understood one word of. And then Lady Selina Cassel put down her cup and said, "Gervase, that woman is not asking for anything." And I have never in my life met anybody who was not asking for anything. The last day of March, in the year 1802, was a Wednesday, and it came in cold and brilliant, with a hard blue sky and a wind off the land, and it was the day of the biggest springtide of the year. Low water was at 11:30 in the morning. High water was at 5:30 in the afternoon, and the boat was to go off the ways at the top of it, and the deed of gift was to be executed on the quay before that, and after the deed the 7 annuitants were to be called, and their names read, and their papers given to them, one by one. By 11 o'clock there were, by the count of the board's own man at the steps, upwards of 500 people on the long quay, and the slip, and the wall above them, which was near enough the whole of Compavin, and half of Bratton. The gentry were in a stand of planks under the boardroom window, with a carpet on it. Sir Hugo Marwood was there, and his daughters, and the Trennance people, and 2 clergymen, and Lady Selina Cassel in furs. The 62 men of the haven stood along the quay edge in their ranks, as they had stood on the 4th of February. The new boat lay on the ways at the head of the slip, with her cork sheer strakes, painted white, and a sail over her stern, and below all of them the haven was empty. It had gone out as it went out twice in every day, and at 11 o'clock it was very nearly at the bottom, and there was 340 yards of grey-ridged sand and black mud between the board steps and the edge of the water, and the 4 ketches were lying over on their bilges along the wall, with their masts leaning. And the Providence, the board's own 6-oared gig, was sitting where she had sat at the bottom of every tide for 30 years, off the board steps, upright on her keel, with her stem in the sand and 2 lines of weed hanging off her moorings, in a place where a child could have walked round her dryshod. Nobody looked at her. Nobody had ever looked at her, any more than a man looks at the doorstep he goes over twice a day. And there was not one soul in that crowd of 500 who had ever in his life held that boat and that sand and a sheet of sworn paper in his mind at the same moment, for the plain reason that the sheet of paper had never once been inside the county. At 20 minutes past 11, the Duke of Halsingham came down onto the quay, and Absalom Roach came out to meet him with his hat off and a face full of pleasant business, and said, in a voice pitched to carry to the back of the crowd, that before his Grace put his hand to the deed there was a small matter of the town's honour to be settled, and that with his Grace's leave he would ask his Grace to read out to the town, there and then from the head of the steps, in his own voice, the sworn evidence of what was done on the night of the 3rd of December, 1796, so that there might be no more whispering in Comphaven. The Duke of Halsingham said that he would not read it there. He said it quietly and without any heat at all, and it took Absalom Roach a moment to be certain he had heard it, and it took the 500 people behind him a good deal longer. Then the Duke turned his back on the stand of planks with the carpet on it, and spoke to the town instead. He said that the paper in his breast stated that the board's own boat had lain afloat at her moorings off those steps at 2 of the clock in the morning, that he had believed that one sentence for 6 years, and had built the whole of this day upon it, and that in 6 years he had never once stood in the place the sentence described. He said that he intended to stand in it now, and that any man in Combevan who wished to hear the thing read might come down and hear it read there. Then he gave his hat and his gloves to a servant, without looking to see who, and walked to the head of the board steps, and went down them, all the way down, past the weed line and the barnacles and the green stone, in a good coat and good boots, on to the floor of the harbour. Absalom Roach could not stop him, and could not follow him without leaving his own stand and his own flag and the whole of his own arrangements standing empty behind him, and could not order one soul off the ground after him, and it took him about 4 seconds to understand why. And the understanding went across his face, in front of the entire town. He owned the Lonquay. He owned the wall and the coping and the dressed stone and the ground behind it and the planks and the carpet and the pole the board's flag stood on. And he had bought every inch of it with his own money, and could put any man in that town off any part of it before his breakfast. He did not own the bed of the Haven. Nobody owned it, and nobody ever had. It went dry twice in every day of the world, and every child born in Comphaven had walked over it, picking the ridges, and there was no by-law, no article, and no resolution of any board that ran 1 inch below the weed line, and the only living creature who could be said to have any authority whatever down there was a woman of no standing of any kind who knew where the soft places were. They came. That is the part that people who were there could never afterwards describe properly. The 62 men of the Haven came off the quay edge after him, without waiting to be told, 4 of them first, and then the front rank, and then both ranks together, down the board steps and off the slip and over the wall on ladders, and after them the town, 500 of them, women with babies and boys and old men, down onto the sand, and the gentry came too, off their planks, with the carpet on it, Sir Hugo Marwood and his daughters holding their skirts up out of the mud, and not caring, and Lady Selina Cassell was carried down in her chair by 4 men, and set on the hard sand, and sat there in her furs, with her hands in her lap, looking about her. Inside 4 minutes, the finest occasion Absalom Roach had ever got up in his life was standing empty in the sunshine, with a flag on it, and the whole of that population was down on the floor of the harbour, where he had nothing. The Duke of Hulsingham walked out from the foot of the steps to where the Providence lay, and stopped beside her, and put his hand flat on her dry stem. With the weed hanging off her mooring chain, and a gull standing on her transom, and the hard ridged sand round her full of broken shell. Then he took the folded sheet out of his breast, and he did not open it, because he had known the words by heart for 6 years, and had never in his life needed to look at them, and he said them out loud, standing on dry ground beside her, in the flat voice of a man reading out a bill of lading, that the said boat the Providence, then lying afloat at her moorings off the said board steps, was by these deponents slipped and manned at 2 of the clock in the morning, and was by them pulled out over the said bar in a great sea. There was a silence of about the length of a breath. Then a boy of 10 or so, standing under the Providence's transom with his hand on her rudder pintle, laughed out loud. It was not a clever laugh, and he was not being clever. He had heard a grown man say, in a very solemn voice, that this boat had been floating at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the boy was at that exact moment standing in the place she would have been floating in his boots, dry to the ankle, and he laughed the way a child laughs when somebody says the church is upside down. His mother struck him on the ear, and the sound of it carried. And then nobody hit anybody, because the laugh had gone into that crowd like water into dry rope. It went through the 62 men of the haven, and it did not come out the other side as laughter. It came out as a kind of low noise, with no words in it, the noise a body of men makes when every single one of them has understood the same thing at the same instant, and none of them wants to be the first to say it. Hats came off and went on again. Men who had been standing at ease came to stand very straight. Somebody at the back said one word out loud that was not fit for the gentry to hear, and was heard by all of them anyway. Absalom Roach had come down after all, because staying up on an empty quay by himself would have been worse than anything that could happen to him on the sand, and he had come in his good shoes, and by the time he was 50 yards out he had gone in over the ankle twice, and he stood at the back of his own townspeople on ground that was not his. He had been master of that board for 12 years, and had never once in that time failed to know what a crowd on his own quay was doing. And this was not his quay, and he had no idea at all what was happening to him. Then the Duke of Halsingham turned round to the 62 men and did the only clever thing he did in the whole of that business, which was to ask a question he did not know the answer to, and to ask it of the right people, and to ask it in the one place in Cumbaven where no man could be quietly spoken to about it afterwards. "You are the men of this haven," he said. "I am going to ask you one thing, and I will have it from you, and not from any gentleman standing on this sand. On the night of the 3rd of December, 6 years ago, at 2 of the clock in the morning, at the bottom of the biggest spring tide of that winter, was there water under this boat?" Nobody spoke for perhaps 4 seconds, which is a very long time in front of 500 people. Then Wilmot Slee, who was 65 years old and had a bad hip and had been a hobbler in that haven since he was 8, and whose name was the 4th name on the paper in the Duke's hand, said, "No, Your Grace." He said it to the sand. He did not look up. And having said it, he went on, in the flat voice of a man who has been waiting 6 years to be asked, and has never once been asked, that there was not water under that boat at 2 o'clock on any night God ever made, nor at the bottom of any tide since the harbour was a harbour, that she dried out 2 hours before low water. Every ebb of her life and every man standing on that sand knew it and had known it since he was a child, and that no boat went off the board steps that night, nor could have, and that it had lain on him for 6 years. Jory Pethick said, "Nor did I ever say she did." I put my mark where I was told to put it. Amos Prouse said nothing at all, and took his hat off and stood holding it. And then the Duke of Halsingham did the thing that made it a day that town told its children about, which was that he did not argue with anybody, and did not send for a lawyer, and did not ask another question. He put the affidavit inside his coat, and he looked out past all of them at the water, which was 340 yards away and going down still, and he said, "Then come and show me." And the whole of that population walked out from the Providence across the bed of their own harbour, in the brilliant cold sunlight, with the wind off the land, 340 yards to the edge of the water. Absalom Roach walked it with the mud dragging at him, and nobody beside him. Nobody jeered at him. That was the thing that finished him. 500 people walked past Absalom Roach on the sand, and not one of them said a word to him. And he arrived at the edge of the water alone, and stood at the back. At the water's edge, the Duke of Halsingham turned round and looked back at where they had come from. The long quay stood up a long way off, grey and high, with the ranks of empty windows above it and the new boat small on the slip. The Providence was a black speck under the wall. Between him and it there was that enormous grey floor with 500 pairs of footprints on it, ridged hard, every ridge full of broken shell, running with an inch of fresh water off the Merrick. He asked her to come out. She had not come with them. She was standing at the bottom of the board steps where she had been standing all morning, and it took a full 3 minutes for her to walk out to them, and 500 people stood in the wind and watched her do it, and the only sound in the whole of that haven was the sea working on the Sull. When she came up to him, he said, "Show me where he was put down." Damaris Yeo did not say anything. She walked past him along the water's edge about 40 paces to the northward, and stopped and put the toe of her boot into the sand, and said, "About here. It moves. The bar has come in a little since. And you went in from where?" She pointed back at the quay. "On foot. There is no other way," she said. There was no water. There is never any water. The Duke of Halsingham stood on the sand where he had been put down 6 years before, and he looked at 340 yards of ridged shell between himself and the steps, and then he pulled off both his gloves and gave them to somebody without looking to see who, and he pushed up the sleeve of his coat and the sleeve of his shirt on his right arm, and then on his left, and he turned both his forearms over in the sunlight so that everybody standing near enough could see them. From the wrist to the elbow, on the inner side of each arm, there were 2 long white ropes of scar. "I have asked 4 physicians about these," he said, and his voice was not steady, and he did not trouble to make it steady. "I have been told for 6 years that I was lifted over the gunwale of a boat. I have dreamt about being dragged on my face for 6 years, and I have been told it was the fever. Nobody in my life has ever been able to tell me where these came from." He looked at her. "Say to me what you said to me." And Damaris Yeo, standing on the wet sand at the edge of the ebb on the last day of March, in front of the whole of the town she had been born in, said, in exactly the voice she had used at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of December, 1796, with her mouth against a drowning man's ear, "Blow it out. Do not take it in. Blow it out, and I will do the rest." The Duke of Halsingham put both his hands over his face and stood absolutely still, and 500 people looked at their boots. The tide turned under them while they were out there. It came in over that ground the way it had come in twice a day for 1,000 years, without hurrying and without any interest in anybody's business, and it drove them back up the sand in 1s and 2s and then in a crowd, and it took 2 hours and a quarter to cover the 340 yards, and in the hours that the flood took the whole of the rest of it was done, on the sand and on the steps and on the quay, in the wet and the sun. The 7 names were struck out of the deed of gift with a pen at the boardroom table, and the $280 a year was settled instead upon the town forever, for the keep of the boat and the carriage and the horses and the house. The deed was executed at 4 o'clock in front of everybody, at the head of the board steps on the top of a beer barrel that Loveday Yeo had rolled up out of her own cellar. because not one person in Cwmbefin went back onto the stand of planks that afternoon, and the carpet on it lay there in the sun, with nobody on it, until it was rolled up at dusk, and the Duke of Halsingham put into it, in his own hand, in a clause that his lawyer afterwards said was the worst drafted thing he had ever seen in an instrument of gift, and the only one that had ever made him cry, that the boat should go off when Damaris Yeo of Cwmbefin said she should go off, and should be steered when she went by Damaris Yeo, and that no by-law, article, or resolution of any board should be taken to touch it. Nathan Roach came into the town at 10 minutes past 4. He had walked from Bideford, 16 miles, having heard nothing at all, only that the day was the day, and he came down the long quay through 500 people, with the mud of the road on him, and stopped in front of the Duke of Halsingham and said, before anybody could stop him, and before he knew a single thing that had happened that morning, that he had never had his grace by the coat, that he had been 22, and had put his name to what his father put in front of him, and that the person who had brought his grace up the steps had brought him up on a line over her own shoulder while he stood at the top and did nothing, and that he had had 6 years of it, and could not do the day. His father was standing 8 feet away, and heard the whole of it. Absalom Roach was not prosecuted, and he did not leave the county, and he did not lose his money. He owned the Long Quay on the 2nd of April exactly as he had owned it on the 1st, and he owned the kilns and the rope walk and the 7 vessels, and he lived in that town for 22 more years. What he lost was the only thing he had ever really been buying with any of it. On the 2nd of April, the other 4 members of the board met without him, and he ceased to be master of the haven. And after that, when Absalom Roach came out of his own door and walked down his own quay, the men of Cwmbefin went on with what they were doing. At 5:30 the water was at the top of the wall, and the harbour was full and green and shaking with light, and the new boat went off the ways with a noise like a gun, and came up level, and swung to her lines, with every man in the town roaring at her. Pinnock had cut the name into her sternboard that afternoon while the flood came in, and it was not Providence. It was her own name, cut deep into the oak and painted white, and it was the first time in 30 years that the name of Damaris Yeo had been written down on anything in that haven at all. They warped her round to the foot of the board steps, and Damaris Yeo went down the steps into her and took the tiller, because there was nobody on that coast the town would have had take her out. And the Duke of Halsingham came down the steps after her, off the stone and into the boat, and stood in the stern sheets of a vessel floating in 4 feet of green water at the bottom of a wall, with the whole of Cwmbefin leaning over the coping above him, the 62 men of the haven, and the gentry off their planks, and Lady Selina in her furs, and Loveday Yeo up on a beer barrel, and Absalom Roach at the head of his own steps, with nothing below him that belonged to him. And there, with the town looking down at the pair of them, the Duke of Halsingham took Damaris Yeo's 2 hands and turned them over, so that the palms were up, split across the knuckles and brown to the wrist and shaking, and he laid his 2 bared forearms down across them, scar to skin, and held them there. And he asked her, out loud, so that every soul above them heard it, to marry him. She did not say anything. She never was much for saying things. She closed both her hands round his wrists, hard, the way she had closed them on the 3rd of December, 1796, in 18 inches of black water, and she did not let go, and that was the answer, and the town gave it back to her off the water, and off the stone, and off the hill behind, and went on giving it for a very long time. Jarvis Yeo gave up his license on the 2nd of April, of his own motion, in 4 words, and went as second hand in the new boat, and was in her for 34 years, and was never afraid in her once. The 4th article of the by-laws of the Haven was not altered that year, nor for a great many years after it, and Damaris was never licensed as a pilot of Cumbaven in the whole of her life, and it did not signify, because a deed executed on the last day of March had said in plain English who steered that boat, and because after the last day of March there was not a master coming in over the Sull who would have taken any other hand on his tiller. They were married in the parish church at Bratton on the 2nd of June. But on the evening of that same last day of March, on the 1st of the ebb, before the light went, the boat that was named for her went out over the Sull, with 10 of them at the oars, and the Duke of Holsingham on the after thwart, and Damaris at the helm with her right hand on the tiller, and her left on the gunwale, taking a great man's gift out through the goot for the first time, and she got her head round to him halfway over, and told him what the water was going to do next.